I'm Dr. Mollie Marti, and welcome to Resiliency Matters. This is where we take the big resilience research and best practices and break it down into small bite-sized pieces that you can begin using immediately to strengthen yourself and others. What if you could learn from an experienced crisis response specialist? Would you spend the next 28 minutes with us? What if in the next 10 minutes you could learn how to help a child deal with death? Would you hang out with us? Who is us? My other half today is Dr. David Schonfeld, an esteemed pediatrician, medical professor, and director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. David routinely responds to national tragedies, including school and community shootings, natural disasters, and wildfires. Welcome, David.
Good to be here.
It is really a treat to see you 2 days in a row. I want to thank you again for the excellent day of learning you provided for our Resilience First Aid series yesterday. And I'm excited to capture more of your brilliance for our wider audience today.
Well, thank you.
So, how common is loss in children or for children?
Well, if you look at loss specific to death of a family member or a friend, that is quite common. We estimate about 9 out of 10 children will experience the death of a family member or close friend by the time they complete high school. And we know specifically that about 1 out of 20 children experience the death of a parent by 16. Of course, if you include other types of losses, it's far more common.
And how is bereavement different than other types of losses?
Well, bereavement is specifically the experience of losing someone through death. But if you think about all the other losses that children experience, whether it's because a parent is deployed or incarcerated, or there's a divorce and one of their parents moves out of state, or if a parent is present but not healthy or isn't able to spend much time with them, they also experience a type of loss from that too. So if you broaden it to all of the experiences of loss that children have, it is extremely common.
And in the news and even in the field in which we work, we hear a lot more about trauma-informed care, the impacts of trauma, versus bereavement or impacts by other loss. Do you see that in your work?
Well, in the work that I do, I usually see both occurring. They often co-occur. But when people focus just on the trauma of the experience that had happened, they sometimes don't recognize that the loss persists in different ways. And that experience is interpreted differently. So as an example, when I was responding to one community shooting that had occurred, and the individual experienced the death of a person that was on either side of him. And he was a teenager at the time, and for about 3 weeks afterwards, he declined to come to school. He only came once and left shortly thereafter. And he wasn't communicating that much with people at the school. So we went to his home. He accepted text messages, so he accepted our invitation to come over. And I asked him why I wasn't getting any counseling, and he said that they just kept wanting to talk about the shooting, and he really didn't have an ongoing reaction to that. He said that he had some symptoms for about a week. He had trouble sleeping, concentrating, felt jittery, but that those had actually gotten better. And so then I asked him why I didn't leave his house, and he looked at me and he goes, I leave my house every day, but I just go and I meet with my friends who were there when the shooting occurred. And then I asked him why he wasn't in school, and he just said, well, it didn't seem right to be there without her. He was on a date with the girl that he planned on marrying, and after her death, he just didn't feel it was right to be back in school. And so when I looked at him and I said, so perhaps you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. He looked at me, he was surprised, and he said, that's it. And if someone's willing to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling right now. I just don't want to keep talking about the shooting. But there was a presumption that since he had been through something traumatic, it was very traumatic, that all of his problems were related to that trauma. But it isn't always from that. Sometimes it's around loss. And we find that people need different things or benefit from different things when they've lost something as opposed to when they've experienced a traumatic event. I talked to one of the parents who experienced the death of one of her children in the shooting that happened at Sandy Hook. And she told me that at the end of the school year, she got the yearbook and the picture of her child who had died had been removed. She said all the pictures of all the children and staff who had died were no longer there. And she said it's as if they never existed. So if you look at the event as just a traumatic event, then you probably wouldn't want to be reminded about that trauma in pictures. But if you also recognize there's loss associated with it, then people need to make meaning of that. They need to stay connected to individuals that they care about who have died. and you would want pictures. So I think we have to look at both, and that of course just makes it a little more complicated, but that's really how we support people.
It means we also have to ask a lot of questions and listen, and that also makes it more complicated, but it is the path forward.
Right.
Yeah. So is there a time when children get over loss? Or
Well, if a loss is significant to someone, it persists for the rest of their life. They constantly revisit the loss that they've had and try, as they get to a new developmental period, or they've accumulated more experience, or they've reached more maturity, they try and rethink that loss to come up with some better understanding of what happened and how to cope with it. And fundamentally, it's never a fully satisfying experience. They don't come up with an explanation that makes it all okay. So they keep reprocessing it. They also start to recognize that the loss grows in some ways as they get older. They certainly can cope with it, and they may be able to be better adjusted to that loss, but the nature of the loss keeps growing. So if you think about it, if your parent dies when you're 8 years old, you miss them for certain things. And then when you are going to go into high school, you miss the parent not being there to help you or to experience that transition with you. And then when you graduate from high school and you have to leave the home, you experience that loss again because there isn't an anchor there for you to continue to connect to. And that will happen when you get your first job, when you get married, when you have your first child, when you reach the age of your parent, when your parent died, when you become a grandparent, when you retire. You continually experience and re-experience that loss. And that's why it's so important for us to begin to help children deal with these losses so that we're putting them on the right track for the rest of their lives.
And I can so relate to that, having lost my mother when I was younger, that you don't even know what questions to ask, you know, when I lost her, and then when I would get married or become a mother. Certainly not conversations I had with her when she was here because I didn't yet have that experience.
Right.
So I can relate to that. Very helpful. Thank you. So here is your takeaway from our first segment. Grief is a natural human experience. You can learn how to help children understand and cope with the death. Helping others grieve when we come back.
1 gig is the future, and Mediacom provides the most complete coverage. America's first 100% 1 gig technology network, offering gigabit speeds in every market we serve. In town or out of town, big city or rural, you've got access to the fastest. We know the future will demand more speed, so we've built a network to give you the most. 1,500 communities, 2.7 million homes, 100% 1 gig. At Mediacom, we took our internet to the extreme, building you a fiber-rich network that gives you the hyper-speed you need. 100% gigabit technology, 99% reliability. We wanted to bring you the best streaming, gaming, music, and more. And we're proud to be recognized a top internet provider again and again and again. Thank you for making us your #1 choice. We're proud to take you to the extreme.
Connecting every device, every room, and everyone. That's the power of Extreme. And it keeps getting better with a new multi-point Wi-Fi system that covers your whole home. So you get insanely fast speeds here, here, and here. An all-new standard of technology that makes every TV smarter. And new ways for you to connect with us, like being able to see when your tech will arrive. Technology is awesome. We take it to the extreme.
Welcome back to Resiliency Matters. We are speaking with Dr. David Schonfeld about grieving. So at what age can children understand death and cope with loss?
Well, children of any age react to the death of someone close to them, even if they don't understand what's happened. But on average, we estimate that children understand most concepts about death between around 5 and 7 years of age. But children who've experienced the death of someone close to them, or children who have themselves a serious life-threatening condition, and children who have had explanation from adults, whether in school or at home, they actually have a precocious understanding. They can understand it at much younger ages. I've actually worked with children that are below 2 years of age who clearly understand what's happened.
So how we explain death to children matters. How do we have those conversations?
It's good to keep in mind that there are generally 4 concepts we think children need to understand in order to be able to cope with a death. So one is that death is irreversible. When someone dies, they come back to life. Not like cartoon characters or characters in other television shows. Once someone has died, they don't come back. And a lot of people think, well, that's something that children can't understand until they're much older. But in fact, they understand it from a very young age. I actually explained it to one of my daughters when she was only 20 months old. There was a family member who had died, and I tried to explain what death meant. She hadn't heard the word before. And when I finally said that the person was all gone, she understood that. She went over and got out a baby book that she had, turned to the page where the child turns over the cereal bowl and says, all gone. And she turned to that page, said the person's name, said, all gone. And when I said yes, she never asked to see that individual again. So children can clearly understand all gone, but even adults don't want to accept it when someone dies. We also know that children need to understand that death is final. And what that means is that when life ends, all life functions end. But very young children initially think everything's alive. The television's alive, a car is alive. When we make comments like the car died, we confuse them about what life functions really are. So children need to understand that when someone has died, their body doesn't move, but they also can't see or hear or feel. And that's why we can bury someone after they've died. Children also need to understand the cause of death. If they don't understand the cause of death, then they're more likely to think that it was from something they did or didn't do, or something that the individual did that they're now being punished for. And they also need to know that death is inevitable. All living things eventually die. Otherwise, they may conclude that the person did something wrong, and that's why they died. In that case, you should be ashamed of their death. Or that the child did something wrong and the child is being punished, at which point you feel guilty about it.
So do you find that adults are comfortable talking with children about death?
Actually, many adults are quite uncomfortable, and they tend to just say nothing because they're afraid they're going to upset someone or that they're going to say the wrong thing. And I would say saying nothing is the wrong thing. It communicates to children either that you're unaware that they've experienced this, or that you don't care, or that you're unwilling or unable to help. And those are all bad messages for children to receive.
So let's help some of our adult viewers at home. We're going to go through some tips on do's and don'ts. Can you walk us through these?
Sure. And first, these tips are intended for when you're talking to an older child or an adult even, not when you're talking to a 1 or 2-year-old or 3 or 4-year-old.
Okay.
And it's in the context of there's been a recent loss, and you're focusing on the need of the grieving individual. There are situations where these may be completely okay, particularly when you're trying to give mutual support. You're talking to a peer, you're talking to a friend or a family member. But in general, you don't want to try and cheer up survivors. I tell people anything that begins with "at least" is something you should reconsider. Comments like "at least he's not in pain anymore," "at least you still have your brother," those comments tend to try and minimize the distress. And in general, we say that because we don't like to see the grief of others, and we want them to stop grieving, but that's not really in their best interest. You don't want to encourage others to be strong or cover their emotions. You want them to be able to express how they're feeling. And you don't want to use statements like, "I know exactly what you're going through." You really should ask people what they're feeling and what experience they're having, rather than telling them that you already know what that is. You also don't want to say things like, "You must be angry." You don't want to tell them how to feel. You can ask them how they're feeling. You can say, I saw you on the playground and you were yelling at someone, and then you slammed the door and you threw your books on the ground. It seems to me like you might be angry. Am I reading that correctly? So you can offer an interpretation, but you shouldn't tell them. And then comments like, both my parents died when I was your age. A lot of times people want to share their personal loss story, if only to validate that they really have the ability to provide support. But really, once you share your story, you really do one of two things. Either you beat the individual. The child says, my dog died, I'm really upset. And you say, well, actually, my parent died yesterday. And now the child has to focus their support on you, when it's really all about them when they're grieving. Or you might actually give a comparison that isn't as big in the child's eyes. I knew one nurse who told a family that they understood what they were going through since their child died that weekend because her dog had died that weekend, and they were then insulted by it. So I think the point is you draw from your personal experience, but in most situations, if this is your job to support the kid, like you're a teacher or you're a professional that's working with a child, then I would keep that experience to yourself in most situations, and really just focus on the child's experience of loss and what happened to them.
Excellent. So wonderful tips there. Talk a bit about grief triggers and helpful responses to these.
Well, grief is not just a linear process. You have times where things remind you of the loss and you get more upset. It might be around, anniversaries of the death or birthdays of the deceased or holidays, and they can trigger some of those feelings. But sometimes just simple comments can also trigger them, where somebody mentions something that reminds you of the person that died. Or it could even be that a substitute teacher comes in and they're wearing the same perfume as your mother used to use before she died. Or somebody sings a song that was a song that reminds you of the individual. Or they're doing a Mother's Day activity in class and you are acutely reminded that your mother is no longer alive. And in those situations, you can feel a little bit overwhelmed and caught off guard. So we want adults to tell children this happens, and it's okay when it happens. That it doesn't mean that you're out of control, it doesn't mean that you're not coping effectively, it just means that you're reminded. And then what you can do is give them a safety plan, that they can step out of the classroom if they feel like they're going to start crying, that they can take some moment off where they compose themselves. And if they know they can leave the classroom if they're going to get overwhelmed, they don't usually have to leave. It's that feeling of being trapped, which is usually so upsetting. I actually had one girl that told me that it had been 4 years since her father died, and she was still having grief triggers. But actually, she liked that because they reminded her of her dad and reminded her that she still was close with him.
Excellent. You also share one that stays with me is a teacher had a communication with a student using her hood.
Yeah.
And when she just didn't want to talk or needed her time, she'd put her hood up and they communicated that way.
They referred to it as a hoodie moment. And what he said was, look, she's at least in class. It's better than her being home grieving by herself. And she's still learning some while this is going on. And I'm going to respect the limits that she sets because she knows when she's ready to be able to participate actively in class. And I thought that was very nice. I think what was the nicest part about it was that the teacher had the conversation with the student. And then showed that respect that the student know how to really gauge her own grief and be able to cope with it.
Some great examples of just talking with our kids and asking questions and listening to those answers. So here's your takeaway. When you allow others to freely express their emotions without judging or trying to change them, you support healthy grieving. Dealing with and leading after crisis. Stay tuned.
At MediaCom, we took our internet to the extreme, building you a fiber-rich network that gives you the hyper-speed you need. 100% gigabit technology, 99% reliability. We wanted to bring you the best streaming, gaming, music, and more. And we're proud to be recognized a top internet provider again and again and again. Thank you for making us your #1 choice. We're proud to take you to the extreme.
Connecting every device, every room, and everyone. That's the power of Extreme. And it keeps getting better with a new multi-point Wi-Fi system that covers your whole home. So you get insanely fast speeds here, here, and here. An all-new standard of technology that makes every TV smarter. And new ways for you to connect with us, like being able to see when your tech will arrive. Technology is awesome. We take it to the extreme. Technology, it is awesome. But when you have the power to control it, that is extreme. With extreme speeds up to 1 gig, there are no limits. Go ahead and stream on every screen. As for the big screen,
show me Discovery.
Ask and you shall receive with the all-new Extreme Speak and Show remote. And if you need to ask for help, just click and we'll show up too. That's the power of awesome technology, powered by Extreme.
Welcome back to Resiliency Matters. We are speaking with Dr. David Schonfeld about grieving and loss and trauma. Wanting to move into leadership and creating cultures of resilience and healthy grieving, we hear a lot about survivor's guilt. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I constantly find it amazing how many ways people can feel guilty after a death has occurred, or a crisis for that matter. And so survivor guilt is just one of those ways. They feel guilty because they survived the event. I've seen people feel guilty because they weren't there on the day that the event occurred because of some coincidence. They were off site. Sometimes they feel guilty because of something they think they did or didn't do or should have done or could have done that would have changed it. At some level, we feel that people sometimes prefer, at least on an unconscious level, to feel guilty about the death that's occurred because the alternative would be to recognize they had no part in it. And if they have no part in it, that means it could happen again. So by assuming some guilt, they actually create an illusion of control. If only I'm a better person, or if only I'm kinder, or if only I make sure every time somebody looks ill that I take them to the doctor, then it won't happen again. The problem is that guilt doesn't actually prevent further incidents from occurring, and it's hard to cope with. And so it's not a good coping mechanism, but it's extremely common.
You said yesterday when you were teaching that you've only seen maybe 2 or 3 instances where there hasn't been guilt. Like, it is that common. So I think it's important to kind of normalize that for our viewers, that guilt is a common part of the grieving process. And when you can move through.
And just because you feel guilty doesn't mean you actually are guilty. A lot of times it will appear irrational to other people, and children and adults won't share it because they don't want to come forward and say they're responsible. I went to one school after a child died of unknown causes. I mean, the autopsy was negative, there was no alcohol or drug use, and they never figured out why she died. But I offered to meet with the kids individually if they wanted to talk, and one girl signed up and spoke with me, and she was a junior in high school at the time, and she said, I know this may sound odd, but she asked, do you believe you can actually predict the future? And I asked her what she meant, and she said, well, when I look at my friends, I can see what college they're going to go to. And I had actually looked at this friend that died a couple weeks beforehand, and I didn't see any college. And at that point, I knew she was going to die, and I didn't do anything, and it was my fault. So sometimes the guilt feelings can be completely unpredictable. So I have actually made it a habit of reassuring individuals that they're not responsible, even if there's no reason to think they're guilty, because it happens so often.
And you go into situations a lot post-crisis. Let's talk about leadership in those situations.
Yeah, leadership is really difficult in those situations. You know, I've sat down with a number of superintendents and elected officials, and I just look at them and I say, you do realize that no matter what you do, everyone's going to be upset. And I remember I said that to one leader, and she asked me to repeat it 4 times. And she said, I need to remember that. Because the issue is they often don't know exactly what to do, and they hope that they can finally help people feel better. But in horrible and tragic situations, people don't feel better, and that's not a realistic goal. So I think we have to recognize that a lot of times people not only feel guilty, but sometimes they blame others. And if the superintendent didn't make a mistake, then that means their other child that's going to the school is just as much at risk of dying as these other children that died. And so as a result, there's often these calls to fire people or remove them or blame them. I was talking to one principal. It was actually after a community shooting. And after I had done the presentation and talked about guilt, he took me aside and he said, you know, we had several students die of suicide a couple of years ago. And there were a number of staff that said to me, if I was a better principal, perhaps those children would still be alive. He said, I had to live with that guilt for several years. I really wish we had talked back then. So I mean, I think the issue is that guilt is very common, and so is blame. And unfortunately, both just impede the coping process and adjustment. So we really need to be conscious about them, we need to talk about it, and then we need to make sure that we can help people deal with that.
In our experience in communities, we've seen how healing it can be to give that benefit of the doubt to the leadership, to assume that they do care, they are trying their best, they're invested in the safety of those children and in the community.
Correct.
It goes a long way. So this is challenging work that we do in the leaders in post-crisis communities. Let's talk about self-care, professional self-care tips.
Sure. I think the first thing is to recognize that you are only going to be able to do this work if you take care of yourself. And that is true for school professionals, it's true for government officials, it's true for leaders of any sort, and it's also true for the professionals who respond to these events. If we don't take care of ourselves, we really have very little to give to others. And so we need to make sure that our crisis plans attend to the needs of the professionals that are doing that work, and that those professionals provide a model of caring for themselves so that those that look up to them recognize that they too need to care for themselves.
I would like to talk about resources because you have so many.
Sure.
So I know when we did our training yesterday, these are two of my favorite. After a loved one dies, how children grieve and how parents and other adults can support them, which is available both in English and in Spanish. And these handy dandy cards, what to say and what not to say, and just walk you through some things that commonly are said after a person dies and perhaps better alternatives.
And both of those are available in English and in Spanish on the website in hard copies. So you can actually go to grievingstudents.org, we'll share the website later, and just click the purple link that says Order Free Materials. You'll go to the Fulfillment Center for the New York Life Foundation that pays for these resources, and you can order copies. And actually, there's no charge even for shipping and handling. But for the booklet, after a loved one dies, you can download that in English, Spanish, and in Japanese as a PDF. And you can print it, you can email it, you can place it on a website. You don't need to ask any permission to be able to freely distribute it. So if you need it right away, probably the best thing to do is to download the PDF, but you can also order hard copies.
Excellent. Yeah, I have given so many copies out personally to friends who perhaps their spouse died and to help them with their children. And then I want to also hold up one of your books, but The Grieving Student. David is the author of over 100 book chapters, books, articles, very well published and has so many resources. These are such great resources. I hope you viewers do check them out, grievingstudents.org and schoolcrisiscenter.org. And here's tool number 3. Leaders can create a culture of resilience by prioritizing self-care, encouraging people to ask for help, and modeling a willingness to accept help from others. Thank you, David, for joining us today. So informative.
Thank you.
And thank you, viewers, for joining us on MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.